Okay, so this is the quick little Photoshop compositing tutorial based on the renderings that we've done in Max. So this is kind of the finished rendering, finished composite that we're going to develop here. You can start to see I did it in low resolution. You of course will want to do it in higher resolution, but I just did it in low resolution so it'll be quick. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to load each of the items in the stack, in a stack, and then we're going to apply them. So here you can see I've grouped them using the group tool down here, which is this folder. Create that and that will group all of these. So these are the original. We have the selection, we have the ambient occlusion, we have the depth map, then we have the beauty rendering, and then we have the twilight, which is our background sky. And what I do is I make copies of the originals so that, that we always, if I mess up, then there's always a copy backup. So basically we start to think of these things in terms of layers. We have the twilight, the background, and the sky. We have the beauty pass, which is going to be our base layer, so if we turn that off. And then we have a little bit of blurring, which we can turn off. And then we have the next group here, which is our ground plane that we're adding in. And if you'll notice that there's a layer mask associated with that, so that restricts it so that it is just for that bottom area. So if I disable that, you can see that what's happening here, and you can also see that I've distorted that image. I've used the warp tool to make it seem round. Let's get that back on there so that it mimics that shape of that hill. And then on the top of that we have the ambient occlusion, which if you'll notice right in here, if I turn that on and off, you can see a little bit of a difference, but that just adds a little bit of contrast and depth. So that's what we're going to look for. This is our organization. You'll notice here that that what I have, if I turn all of these things off, I have the original layer, and then I've added these adjustment layers, and they have their own little layer masks associated with it. So I desaturated it because at night there's not as much color. I've changed the color to a cooler bluish tint, and then I changed the exposure to darken it up quite a bit. And then these areas here are ones in which I started to paint back in some of that detail, so basically to simulate the light falling on the ground and the fact that there would be a little bit more of the original color and saturation back in there, and that's what each of those represents. So without further ado, let's create let's replicate this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to File, and we want to go down here to Scripts because we want to load all of these into one image. So we're going to say load files into a stack. So we're going to load all of those files into a separate layer. It's going to bring up this load layers. We want to browse to find our images. So I've already saved them. So I've got my background and all of those in one place. Just going to select them all. Click Open. And it's great. Okay, so we've got the background and it's loading all of the layers. It'll take just a minute. Okay, we're almost done here. Okay, so we've got all the layers now loaded in. You'll notice that it made the largest layer based on the size of the largest image, which was the twilight sky. One of the things that I want to do here is just for the first part start to adjust that. So I'm going to use Control T or Command T. We can also edit free transform, and what we're going to do is make this image of the sky slightly smaller so that it fits into what we were looking for. Okay, I'm going to hold down the Shift key so that I keep it in general size, and then I'm going to want to make this just slightly bigger so that I can have a little bit of a difference, so I can move it around and adjust things a little bit. So it's not going to be quite as big. Hit enter when I'm ready, and then I'm going to go up here to image and adjustments, and I'm going to adjust or canvas size, and I'm going to change the canvas size because I want it to fit that 800 by 600 renderings that I've done. So I'm going to switch that to pixels, change it to 800 by 600, start in this top corner because I want it to shift into that top corner. So click OK. It's going to say it's going to crop. I'm going to say that's fine. Okay. So now we have these different layers. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a group. And I'm going to rename this group Originals. And I am going to click and drag those originals into that size. So that's great. Now I'm going to take all of those and drag them down to the new layer, and so they'll create new copies. I'm going to drag those up and out of the originals. So now I've got a backup. These I'm never going to lose, so that's going to be good. Okay, so we've got the beauty pass, we have the ambient occlusion, and then this one I misnamed, so this should be depth pass. Okay, so, and the depth is a completely optional one, so I'm going to turn it off for the moment. We have the ambient occlusion and we have the beauty pass. So the first thing we want to do is switch this ambient occlusion, and we want to turn it up here to multiply. So we want it to overlay that. So let me zoom in here. You can start to see a little bit what's going on here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this. So I can go to Image, Adjustments, Brightness, and Contrast, because I want to tweak that a little bit. So I want to not have as much contrast, and I want to turn this down a little bit so that it's a little bit more noticeable. So now when I turn it on and off, you can start to see that that's emphasized a little bit more. That's good. You'll notice that we have our background and it's already adjusted, but we can tweak that a little bit. So let's go down here and get that where we want it. I think it's nice that it has that little moon there, but I want us to have a little bit more. We want to really create this contrast here, and so that this edge starts to really sing and then get bordered in. So I think that's good for that. Okay, so we've got that there. We have our beauty pass. So the first thing, or the next thing we should do is start to think about, okay, we need to have this texture here. and get that loaded in and start to think about our making our first layer. So we know that our next piece is going to be putting in that information. So I'm going to click over here above the beauty and create a new group. That group is going to be called ground. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and click down here to our selection, move over and go with the magic wand tool and select that. So we have that as our selection. Then while that's selected, we go back to ground, and then we're going to use this great tool here, which is add a layer mask. So now everything that's underneath this in this ground is going to be masked off to this area, so it will cut off all of this other stuff, and that's going to be really helpful. And then we can do all our layers adjustments and things like that. So this layer mask tool is incredibly helpful, adjusting textures and things like that. So next thing to do, let's open up our background texture. Let's see, I'm going to go back to, let's see, no, don't want that, don't want that one. That's the one I want. Open that. And then all I'm going to do is, since it's open off here, I'm just going to grab this and drag it and drop it in. And you'll notice that it's come in underneath here. If it hasn't, you can just click and drag it into our stack here, so underneath our ground. But we can see that it needs to be moved around, so we can grab this and just grab our move tool, and we can just start adjusting it. Okay, that looks good. Now we want to adjust it by warping it so that we can start to get it around that edge, so it makes sense. So we'll go to transform and we'll go to warp. You'll notice that we get this, so I'm just going to zoom out. And what I'm going to do is just start by taking these things and just dragging this around. You don't want those tints to get in there. Okay. I'll hide these for a moment so that I can get in here and tweak these. Okay. So that looks like that's going to work for me pretty well. Zoom back in here. Yeah, that looks good. So we're going to hit enter. Alright, so now we can open up our layers palette again. Alright, so we have that. Now the first thing that we want to do is add some adjustment layers here. So with this one here, first thing we want to add, let's say, is that exposure. So we kind of turn it dark. And you'll notice that I have the properties palette turned on up here. You can get to that by Windows and properties. I just like to have it open. so that as I'm adjusting, now I can turn these guys down. Okay, so that's good, maybe just a tad more. And then the next thing I'm going to do is add another layer adjustment. And this one we're going to do color balance. And so this one I'm going to turn off the exposures, and I'm just going to tweak this thing a little bit so that we get some of that bluish sky. Get that colder. Okay, that's good. Turn back on our exposure. So we have this blue. Now we want to be able to go back in here and adjust this color balance. So these are its own separate layer masks. So if we go back in and paint on these layer masks, we can adjust the colors, so we can start to add back in this in the exposure. We can add back in the light. So we do that by painting black. So we'll take a brush, then we'll make sure that our color down here is black, is on the foreground, and then we're going to take this and we just want to go our brushes and get a airbrush. Okay, and we can adjust the size here if we would like, or we can adjust the size using the bracket keys. And I'm just going to get it kind of big at the moment. And the one thing we want to adjust here is the opacity. We want to turn that down to 15, 17, somewhere around there. And then we just go back in here and paint back in that brightness. Okay, and then do the same thing here and just paint back in some of that color. Okay, so we've got that. That's pretty easy. A couple of things that we noticed that we could do is you can come over here and maybe just give it a tad more saturation over here. Same thing with our color balance. Just a tad more. Okay. And then what we notice though is if we go back, if we turn off this layer, we have this bright line, right? This shadow line right here, and we want to still have that shadow line. So one of the things we can do is go over here to our lasso tool, polygon lasso tool, and we can just make a quick selection. Now we can turn this back on and we have this selection, so it's going to keep us a nice hard edge here, and we can go and take the eraser tool, make sure we have a nice brush, and then maybe its opacity of 60% or so, maybe make it a little bit bigger, and we can just go in here and erase that adjustment. Notice I'm just going to let it bleed off over here, and I just really want it to be sharp right at this edge. And then I'll go down into the exposure and I'll do the same thing here. And I'm just going to let it bleed off down this edge. So I'm just going to work up here and then let it bleed. Okay, So we're going to do Control D, and that gets rid of that selection. So now we get that sharp line, but it bleeds off to the edge, which is good. Then the other thing I want to draw your attention to is this silhouette edge here. We know from this ground that it has some little clumpy grasses and it has some rocks. So what we want to do is adjust this layer so we go up to the ground, and this time we're going to be painting in white because we want to add to that selection. Then the other thing I want to do is make sure my paintbrush tool is selected, and then I'm going to choose, I'm just going to scroll down and choose one of these kind of chalky brushes, something that's a little bit hard like that. And then let's just zoom in here. And then on this one we want this opacity to be turned up quite a bit. So let's go up to 80. And this will require just a little bit of patience and zooming in, and what we want to do is just start to add up to this edge. You can start to see how we clean this edge up here. We're just roughing it up just a tad. I'm just shaking and, you know, I'm just trying to be careful with it not to be too crazy. Just adding some little edge, and then we want to do it on this back side over here too. So I'm just going to zoom over here and just tuck in back over here and do the same. And we can do that here as well, just along this edge. And let's just leave that alone, that's good enough. Alright. Okay, so we have those adjustments. Now we've got that edge, got those things looking pretty good. And so the next piece would be to create this depth of field if we want to do that. So the thing we do there is that we want to take this and we want to use this as an alpha. So we select the depth layer, hit Control A or Command A if you're on using the Mac, and then we want to Control C, which is copy that. And then we want to go to our layers palette or channels palette, and we want to create a new channel, and then we'll edit and paste this, or Control V, into this channel. Okay, and then if we go down here down to the bottom, we can load the channel as a selection, which is good. And we'll go back to our layers, and we'll make another copy of our beauty pass. So we're going to just drag that, create a new copy. We'll drag that up here, put it in between there. And then what we want to do is, since we have this depth map selected, we want to add that as a layer mask to our beauty selection. So we click down here to add layer mask. Okay, so that's attached. Now if we want to, we can go up to the filter and blur and go to lens blur, and that's going to bring up this oops, cancel that, screwed up here. We want to make sure that you can see that we can select whether we're working on the mask or whether we're working on the image itself, and we want to make sure that we're working on the image. Now let's go to filter, blur, and lens blur. And I'm going to adjust this radius to turn this up so that it exaggerates how much blurring is happening and where it's happening at. We want to make sure that the depth map, your source over here, is the layer mask. And then the focal distance allows you to move that point. So right now we've got this kind of in the corner there at 156. If I move this, we'll just show you here. Okay, that's moved it off to the edge. Now if I move it the other direction, you can see that it's closer in. It's in this area here. So you can control where your focus is going to be. Let's change that back to 156. That was a good spot. And I want to turn down the radius because I don't really want that much. So I'm going to turn it down to about 8. Okay. And so you can see that that gives us some sharpness here, blurs us a little bit on this edge and along these edges here, which is fine. And then at the end, I want to do more accurate because I want it to look good. Alright, it's going to take a minute. Alright, so now we have that as our edge, our beauty copy. And you'll notice here that if I turn off, this has to be an adjustment over the top of this. Because if we turn that off, then we get this funky weird thing. Okay, so now we've got it, and we're pretty much done. Now I recommend that you file and save it as a Photoshop document, PSD, because that will keep all the layers intact, and then you can go and adjust it to fit whatever you want. You know, if you need to go back and change things or add different textures, you can tweak it. Okay, save as PSD. Maximizing compatibility is always fine. Okay, you're all done. Easy peasy.